Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning. Thank you very much for being with us here at the Festival of Economics. Today, we have the great honor and pleasure to hold a conversation and hear the important contribution from Dr. Graciela CHICHILNISKY, who's listened to us from the other side of the ocean, from New York. So, most warm welcome to you, Dr. CHICHILNISKY. The subject of our conversation today is how to revert the trend of climate change. CO2 direct capture may indeed solve the problem of climate change and relaunch the economy. A short introduction before giving the floor to Dr. CHICHILNISKY. The effects of global warming are certainly self-evident. Isn't that a bit too late to act and prevent the climate catastrophe? In the interview that Graciela CHICHILNISKY released to the Sole 24 Ore on September the 20th last, she answered as follows. Time certainly plays an all-important role. We do have technology available, we do have the financing available, we know what to do, and we do have some time now, but I'm not sure whether we can be in time. Well, and I believe this is an all-important issue, so time is an important issue. Over the last few years, we saw raising awareness on the part of the public worldwide of the risks of our planet given by the global warming. But the time available to avoid a catastrophe may not be enough. So without any further ado, we'd like to welcome Dr. CHICHILNISKY, co-founder and CEO of Global Thermostat and co-inventor of a technology for CO2 removal and capture to revert climate change altogether. This technology has been chosen by the Technology Review of the MIT as one of the 10 technologies of 2019. Graciela CHICHILNISKY has a chair of mathematical statistics at Columbia University. Now I'd like to give her the floor, and at the end of our presentation, I'm going to present her with the questions that are going to be raised by the audience. As Professor CHICHILNISKY probably knows, and because of the COVID, we are having an online conference. So those of us who are listening and following the conference are going to send us the questions online. So while giving her the floor, I'd like to highlight that Dr. CHICHILNISKY certainly appreciates the steps forward made by Europe thanks to the ETS, the European Trading System, which is based on the most advanced system to assess CO2 impact on atmosphere and air in the EU. This system was adopted in 2005, and this is the first international trading system of emissions of CO2. The situation in the US is certainly dramatic differently. The US signed the Kyoto Protocol but hasn't ratified it. Dr. CHICHILNISKY will explain to us the details of the innovative technology for CO2 removal that may revert climate change. And I would like to invite her to dwell, she may, on the potential impact of the forthcoming elections of the President of the US when it comes to the strategy to counter global warming. Altogether, we have an hour available, so Dr. CHICHILNISKY has some 30 minutes for her presentation, and then we're going to take questions from the floor. Having said as much, I'd like to give the floor straight away. So over to you, Dr. CHICHILNISKY, and you're most welcome again. Thank you.
Thank you very much for all of you for being here. This is a particularly important moment, and what we are discussing now is imperative for all of us, in fact, for humankind. By way of introduction, my name is Graciela CHICHILNISKY, and I am the co-founder and CEO of Global Thermostat. And I am the person who designed, created, and wrote into the Kyoto Protocol the carbon market that became the European Union emission trading system, which is very important for what we're talking about here. Let me tell you briefly about Global Thermostat. It was created in 2010, and is a pioneer in the creation of a leading technology called direct air capture that removes CO2 directly from the atmosphere and converts it into commercially useful goods and services that improve and can lead to economic progress. So the mission of this company is to reverse climate change while encouraging economic progress, particularly on issues of inequality, but on the whole. That means that the removal of CO2, the technology that we use for that, which is unique, and as was mentioned, has been designated by Bill Gates and the MIT Technology Review as among the top 10 technologies of 2019, it's imperative that that technology should be cost effective, so that after removing the CO2, you can sell it for commercial uses. What McKinsey states is a $1 trillion market for CO2 in the world. What do you use the CO2 for? You use it for biofertilizers. You use it for food and beverages. You use it for creating or for synthesizing fuels that are clean, so they don't emit CO2 as you use it. You can produce gasoline from water and CO2. And you use it also for desalinating water from the ocean. And all of the above we are doing, for example, with companies such as the Coca-Cola company for carbonated beverages, with Aqua, which is the largest desalinating company for desalination of water in the world, and for the production of clean gasoline, synthetic gasoline, together with AME and Siemens. So this is, in some sense, is essentially what you really want to do, and what is directly related to this presentation here today. However, it's more than that, because the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, where I used to represent as a lead author the United States, has stated in a 2018 report that removing CO2 directly from the atmosphere is now necessary in order to prevent catastrophic climate change. In the United States, the National Academy of Sciences has also published a report saying exactly the same. So what we're doing is not just good to have, it's essential if we're going to prevent catastrophic climate change. So what is direct air capture? Essentially, it's a mechanism that used to exist before, but not in the way it is done now. It removes CO2 by moving a lot of air over monoliths that are embedded in a sorbent that traps the CO2 and then separates those. And what is resulting out of this is a 98% pure CO2 that can be used, as I mentioned before, for commercial purposes. This is what needs to be done now. And the issue of time is critical because we have the technology, as already pointed out, the money is there, but what's missing is time. We're going to discuss about that. I just wanted to say I'm very optimistic about being able to do it, but regretfully, I am pessimistic about the time in which we're going to do it. How did we get here? Well, in 1997, I understood the importance of the economy, which is really what's causing climate change. This is not a physical problem, it's an economic problem in the use of energy that was generated by fossil fuels. Most of the power plants in the world they represent almost 50% of the human emissions of CO2, and most of them, over 90%, are using fossil fuels. And the burning of fossil fuels is what generates climate change, is what generates CO2 into the atmosphere. So in 1997, working with the United Nations, I designed the carbon market of the Kyoto Protocol. Then I helped negotiate it, and then I helped write it. I actually wrote it into the Kyoto Protocol. And much of that is presented in this book that is just appeared called Reversing Climate Change. Essentially, everything I'm talking about appears in my 2020 book that I have with me. This was revolutionary work, and many people were not credulous. But actually, in the year 2020, the magazine Physics Today, that is read by physicists all over the world, documented that in the year 2020, the countries that voted for and participated into the carbon market, particularly the European Union nations, decreased their emissions from 1997 by over 20% of what they were emitting in 1997, which is 23 years ago. This is called success. And the European Union nations have been critical to that, particularly because the United States signed the Kyoto Protocol but did not ratify it. Right now, the question is more complicated because even though 25% of humankind is using the carbon market that I designed and wrote and negotiated into the Kyoto Protocol, which is a great success, the other 75 that didn't ratify, didn't participate, have increased their emissions. So what we need to do now is to resolve climate change for a second time. The first time was done, as I mentioned before, with the use of the carbon market that puts an economic value, negative value, to the emissions of CO2, and therefore creates a positive value for clean technologies and for reducing CO2. That market, the carbon market, has a clean development mechanism that was used to transfer funding to developing nations for the purposes of new clean technology. Over $200 billion were transferred by the clean development mechanism to China. China used that money and their own resources, built tens of thousands of photovoltaic solar plants, and the great news, and it is news, is that this year, 2020, for the first time in human history, solar energy is more efficient and lower cost than fossil fuels, even coal, in producing electricity. So that's going to transform the entire power power plant structure, which is approximately $60 trillion globally. And as I said, it's about 50% of the human emissions. If we can do that, we have the problem solved. So now we have clean technology. Solar photovoltaic is lower cost. It's about 2 to 3 cents the kilowatt hour, lower cost than even coal. The technology also exists for doing what's needed now, which is to remove what's already there, the legacy CO2 that we already put in the atmosphere, because CO2 doesn't decay. It can take 100 or more years until it decays after emitted. So we now have to remove it. And that's what direct air capture is doing. So the European Union emission trading system has played a critical role, but now it has to adapt to the fact that we need not just to limit emissions, as we did with the Kyoto Protocol, and as was suggested by the Paris Agreement, although it was just voluntary, but we need to remove the CO2 that is already there. Do we have enough time to do it? That is the question, and that's what I wanted to talk about now. As I said, China has played a critical role here. The same thing has to be done for removal of CO2 technologies that was done for the creation of photovoltaic, of low-cost photovoltaic energy. It took the Chinese tens of thousands of plants and almost 10 years to reduce by 80% the cost of photovoltaic solar energy. So the energy part now has to be implemented, and it has an economic advantage. It is less expensive to produce electricity with solar energy in the year 2020 for the first time than it is using coal. But now that doesn't suffice. We now have to remove CO2 from the atmosphere. We also have to do it in a way that is commercially feasible, because that is going to help the economy, and then everybody will be in favor. And because that was the main objection that the United States placed to the Kyoto Protocol, that it was going to hurt the economy. We are saying it's going to be the opposite. So now we are working with a consortium of firms. Some of them are oil firms like Exxon, Saudi Aramco. Saudi Aramco has Aqua, is a part of the conglomerate of firms where they actually take water from the ocean. They are the biggest water desalination company in the world. And they are our client in that they need CO2 to do the water desalination, and we provide it. So the economic system is prepared now. Everything is ready. The question is time. We already solved climate change. That was done with the Kyoto Protocol, as I said, documented by Physics Today in 2019. The emissions of CO2 were reduced by the Kyoto nations, and there were 166 nations that signed the Kyoto Protocol. They succeeded in reducing by 2020, by 20%, the emissions in 2020 of the Kyoto nations are 20% lower than they were in 1997 when the Kyoto Protocol was first signed. It's a reduction of 20% of emissions in a 23-year period. It's a great success. But that doesn't suffice. We now have to resolve climate change twice, because the other nations that did not participate in the Kyoto Protocol continued and increased their emissions. So can we now solve climate change for the second time? The answer is yes. I'm very optimistic. We have the technology to remove CO2 and to make that CO2 into valuable goods and services. Actually, we can replace petroleum now, obtained from the ground, by CO2 obtained from air. This is the transformation that is coming. Even The Economist, which is a reasonably State magazine acknowledges that this transformation is coming and is revolutionary. But the question is time. I am not optimistic about time. Pope Francis has written extensively, particularly recently, about the need, for example, by the oil companies in the world, the main oil companies, to join into this struggle. They had to transform themselves. So we're working with a number of oil companies, as I mentioned, and also other large industrial companies, as I mentioned, and with the help of large engineering firms such as Siemens that want to transform energy into clean energy, as I mentioned before. The only way that I can see of doing all this on time, because that's the issue now, time, is through support by all of you. You are critical here, but also finance, because finance can bring enough liquidity so that everybody can join this new industrial revolution, in which we are no longer using petroleum like Rockefeller saw, but we're using CO2. And in using CO2, we're cleaning the atmosphere while we foster economic growth. Time is of the essence, so that's what we're working on. We're working on creating a consortium of firms that will show the world how this can be achieved in all these areas: fossil fuels, food and beverage, desalinating water, biofertilizers, even enhanced oil recovery, which I don't favor because you end up extracting more petroleum at the end. So the question is, can this be done? And make no mistake, it's not just an interesting question. It's not a question about technology, it's not a question about money, it's not a question about economics. It is a question about the survival of the species. Can we resolve climate change for the second time with the technology we have, with the economy that we have, with your help? Can we do it? And the answer to that is the answer about the potential for extinction of our species and to transform it in an enormous engine of economic growth that is needed after the terrible pandemic that is all around us now, all over the world, that needs liquidity, needs economic growth. We can do it for a second time.
Ok, ha finito, quindi grazie. Allora partiamo con le domande.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So let's start with the questions. They are coming very numerous, and I will try to summarize them for you. I will ask one question at a time, if you agree, so you can answer each question. The first question we received concerns the issue of time available, and one which you mentioned many times. The question, considering that time is limited to reduce the emissions, don't you think that we would rather concentrate to change our consumption habits while consuming less and producing less? Because if we produce too much, we have to dispose of the goods. So consuming less and producing less, can that be a solution? This is the first question. You can answer, and then we'll move to the second question.
Yes. Well, I was the person who invented the concept of basic needs. And that was many years ago. And it became the cornerstone of efforts to define sustainable development. Yes, basic needs is what we should be focusing on. And basic needs are focused on consuming what we need, while the current economic system is focused on increasing GDP, which is already thwarted because the price system in markets is very confused. We're trying to change that. Therefore, as you saw, when consumption decreased, unfortunately, due to the pandemic, the consumption of fossil fuels decreased. So you could say that was a solution. You can say anything that decreases rapidly consumption, the way we're doing now, succeeds in reducing emissions of CO2. Is it true? Yes, it is true. But wait a second. The way our economies are organized, unfortunately, the people that are most hurt in this process are the people that need more consumption. They are the lowest income groups. So we are not satisfying basic needs by reducing consumption at present. The people that are most hurt are the low income groups. And that is not something we want to do. So we have to find a way to reduce the unusual, incredibly high level of consumption without hurting the people in the lower income brackets. That is my answer to you. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. But that requires better and more intelligent economic organization under a system of freedom, democracy. But you need to reduce consumption, overconsumption, and that's possible. But as I said, make sure you don't kill the patient by trying to reduce consumption in order to avert the catastrophic effects of climate change, and you end up hurting more than anything the people in the lower income groups that need consumption desperately to survive. 1.3 billion people in this planet right now have little access or none to electricity, but more importantly, are below the level of basic needs. This is not acceptable. This is just not acceptable for human beings. So that's my response.
Grazie, molte grazie. Un'altra domanda che
Thank you very much.
collega anche a una
A second question,
che volevo porle io, quindi le riassumo insieme.
and I summarize in it also a question I wanted to ask you. You said, also in the interview to Sole 24 Ore, that public action is not enough. We also need the support and aid of the of the private sector, and I agree. The question is this: how comes and why should the financial world intervene to fund a green industrial revolution at a time when they can still make a lot of profits from the CO2 capitalism? Do you think that global politics can be involved to promote the strategy to involve the financial world to this route? When I mention private sector, I refer to finance. Maybe you have a wider approach to the idea of the private sector. Can you expand on that?
Yes, that is the most important question in practical terms. We need in Glasgow, in the Convention of the Parties 26, next fall, we need to expand on the provisions of the carbon market so that it can realign economic prices. And therefore, the private sector will have the right incentives to invest where is needed. That can be done by the creation of an expansion of the carbon market to include carbon negative technologies. Carbon negative technologies are technologies that remove CO2 from the atmosphere And that's what's exactly what's needed now. Without doing that, the IPCC, the National Academy are saying we're not going to resolve climate change. How do you include into the carbon market, which is so successful in Europe, how do you include carbon negative technologies? That's what we have to do. How do you do that? It's easy. Essentially, what you want is to transform. You have to work with negative numbers. In other words, instead of putting limits on emissions, which is what the carbon market of the Kyoto Protocol does, and with the European Union emission trading system does, you have to have targets for carbon removal, positive targets. You have to say nations have to invest into, or however they do it, they have to reach a target of carbon negative technologies or carbon negative business. In other words, each nation, instead of limiting their emissions, has to increase, has to lead to a minimum level of carbon removal. This is a matter of investment now. So it's not any longer a matter of reducing the CO2 that we emit. It's a matter of increasing and leading to minimum levels of production of carbon negative technology. We need to remove so much CO2 from the atmosphere. Each nation has to reach a removal target. And then out of that removal target, exactly the same as we did in the carbon market, will arise a number. That's the price, which is a positive price now for carbon removal. And with a positive price, carbon removal becomes profitable. So it's the same thing as the carbon market, but now it's no longer possible to limit what we emit. Now we have to actively, positively remove the CO2 that is there and have those targets for removal. And the target for removal becomes a target for investment, because the only way you're going to remove using technology, the CO2 that you need to remove and use it for commercial purposes, making money. So you can remove CO2 and make money. This is economics, okay? So that new carbon market, which is for carbon negative technologies, does not exist. It's not in the provisions of the European Union emission trading system. I'm telling you, it must be done, and it can be done. And it's very similar, and it rewards all the investors around the world that emit in carbon negative technologies, carbon negative projects, carbon negative firms. How much carbon negative? According to the IPCC and the National Academy, within this within this decade, we have to remove gigatons of CO2. A gigaton of CO2 is 1 billion tons. We need to remove billion tons of CO2. But as we remove that, that becomes synthetic fuels. That becomes desalinated water. That becomes drinks. That becomes, carbonated beverages, and it becomes even proteins that can be produced with CO2, because CO2 is carbon. Carbon is the molecule of life. So what we're talking about here is rewriting the carbon market of the Kyoto Protocol so that it has positive targets of investment. And then the investors around the world have an incentive to invest in carbon negative technologies. That is finance. And there are ways to do it which are so well distributed and so producing so much liquidity as the mortgages market or or securities that are asset-backed securities like those in mortgage markets, which are in the trillions of dollars. The world is looking for that because now, after the after the virus, the COVID, the global problem with the COVID, the world needs liquidity and the world needs to improve economic performance, needs growth, needs jobs, needs production, all of which can be done with carbon negative technologies in a way that cleans the atmosphere while we grow the economy. And it can be done. But we need help of the Convention of the Parties. We need help from the European Union emission trading system because, as you know, there is at present no limits, and there should be, on investment. There should be a minimum level of investment, a minimum level of carbon removal production. Is now, instead of a negative saying, don't emit more than this, you're saying produce at least that carbon negative plans, economic plans, firms, and all the finance that comes along with that. And there is a price there. What I'm talking about doesn't exist, but it's very easy to do within the structure of the carbon market. I know, I wrote the carbon market in 1997 into the Kyoto Protocol. This can be written equally, and I will be willing to go anywhere to get this done and to have any simple explanation as may be needed about how this can be achieved while making money.
Molte grazie per la risposta.
Thank you very much for your reply. Now we are receiving many questions, so I'm trying to summarize a few of these questions in the interest of time. So I'd like to join two questions that I just received. The first question has to do with what we just witnessed over the past few years. Indeed, we've seen an increase in the involvement in the awareness raising of the public when it comes to global warming. And so the first question reads as follows. What do you think that the awareness raising of the public worldwide may contribute to make sure that governments promote strategies, economic strategies to counter climate change? Or do you think that this is the right way ahead? And then there's a second question, if I may.
Okay.
Of course. Only people will decide. And that's what the Pope Francis is also saying. But he's also saying, and I agree, you have to bring into this equation the companies that have been the leaders in emissions, in the production of CO2 emissions, so that they can undergo this transformation together with the new regulation, the new carbon market, which is going to be about carbon removal, not about carbon limits. So the companies that I'm mentioning that include some of the worst culprits in the emission society, such as the oil companies, are very interested in doing that because they realize that due to people, the investment in their companies is now in peril, and therefore they have to change. And they want to change. They would like to make money in a way that helps resolve climate change. They want to be part of the solution, not just part of the problem. Is that easy? No, it's not easy. We know that. But as I said, it is possible, it is desirable, and it is what has to be done now. And by that I mean that there are groups in the public, you people here, and there are financial companies, and there are investors, and there are oil companies, and there are producers of materials, etc., who have this objective. And we all know that innovation can only lead to economic growth. And innovation has led the economy of this century. Therefore, we can do it. What we need is to understand, and I think it starts, as it did in the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, with global, or in this case, European Union agreements about how to incorporate carbon negative emissions into the European Union ETS, which can be done and will be done. It's already being considered, but there is no clarity about what to do. But it's not complicated. I can explain how to do it at a higher level, and the personnel of the European Union emission trading system are unbelievably good, and they can transform that into a reality like that This can be done in the year 2021 and start becoming law in 2022. How do I know? Because in the United States, I wrote a proposal for a law that goes in this direction. It's called 45Q. It became a bipartisan law, and it gives $35 award for any company that removes CO2 from air in the form of carbon of tax credits. That law, 45Q, can be adopted right now in Europe immediately. But I think on top of that, we need to have a part of the global agreement, not just the Paris Agreement, which is full of good intentions, but is totally voluntary, so it has no teeth. But now that we have carbon removal technologies, we can create a carbon removal market that is more advanced than the carbon market and brings the funding and the economics that is needed so that we can remove the carbon as we need to do, for otherwise there is no solution to climate change.
Ok, molte grazie. Abbiamo una domanda dal nostro pubblico virtuale molto interessante che vorrei sottoporle, dottoressa, e riguarda questo aspetto. Secondo lei potrebbe essere ipotizzabile che si mettano in campo delle sanzioni anche di tipo economico nei confronti di quei paesi che non rispettino i protocolli di riduzione delle emissioni di CO2, oppure secondo lei è assolutamente fuori dalla portata, è utopistica una possibilità del genere? A lei la risposta.
I talk a bit of Italian, but not as much as I need to answer your question. Can somebody translate?
Do you think that we can impose sanctions on countries that do not comply with no-emission legislation? Do you think that there is a way to impose sanctions on countries that do not comply with CO2 emissions reductions?
That's what the carbon market does. That's how the European emission trading system succeeded. That's how the clean development mechanism managed to send hundreds of billions of dollars to China, who then proceeded to create the most efficient solar energy system, the solar photovoltaic, in history of humankind. That's how it was done. But at this point, what we need is not to put so much to put those sanctions. What we need is to demand investment. This could be a combination of private and public mechanisms. Instead of putting sanctions, or in addition to, allow the sanctions to be paid by investment achieved. So if the private sector invests in carbon removal technologies that can be considered in a nation, within the nation, as achieving the target of carbon removal. So we can replace the removal of carbon by investment, financial investment in carbon removal, which the IPCC can then sort out and control. So yes, it can be done, but it has to be done the way I'm telling you. In other words, it has to be done so that we transform the sanctions into positive, profitable investment. Am I clear?
Sì, grazie, ho capito. Abbiamo...
Thank you very much. We did understand perfectly. There's another interesting question that I'd like to voice. Earlier on, you talked about the technology being available, the resources being available, but time being the issue. Now, when it comes to the technology that you were referring to, there's a question that is raised by our followers online. We're asking if we could use for the reduction of CO2 another solution, that of curbing deforestation. So to use our natural resources for the absorption of CO2. So there's a government liability that are not acting when it comes to stopping deforestation. For example, we have heard about what is happening in terms of state liability, doing away with all the forests in South America, in Amazonia. What do you think? Would you think that this would be viable?
The problem of the forests is extraordinarily important, not just for climate change, of course, because that's the role of the vegetation of the planet, to absorb CO2, part of the carbon cycle. But for biodiversity, because most of the biodiversity in our planet resides in forests, in jungles. And we are in the 6th largest incident of massive extinction in the history of our planet. Over 4 million years, this is number 6 in terms of size. It's enormous. It is of the proportion of the extinction caused by an asteroid that led to the destruction of the dinosaurs. And the remaining dinosaurs are now flying dinosaurs that became the birds, the chicken. So the question is, at this point, are we preparing ourselves to become human beings? We now control the planet like the dinosaurs did then. Are we going to be the chicken of the future? Are we going to be eaten? Are we going to play the role of the chicken that were the descendants of those dinosaurs? But even though everything I said is true, there isn't enough time to rely on trees for removing the CO2 in the time scale that is necessary. There isn't. The United Nations has done exhaustive research about that, the IPCC, and the answer is clear and absolute. If we just plant a tree, for example, on every square yard available in the planet, at the end of the century, we will have removed only 10% of the CO2 that we are emitting during this period. So natural means do not suffice to combat and to redress and to solve an unnatural problem we created by burning fossil fuels at this extraordinary rate for the industrial society. Doesn't suffice. I didn't say it's not important, it's extremely important. It doesn't suffice. So what can be done with respect to the remaining forests is to create, again, what I call the clean investment mechanism, which is the investment alternative that corresponds to the clean development mechanism. There is a lot of liquidity in the world and a lot of investment capital that is interested in finding new places to invest. And this is a very profitable way to invest. And this is how we should link the sanctions to terminate the burning and the destruction of the forests, the jungles that we need for the survival of biodiversity and for climate change, but to do it in a way that is profitable through what I call the clean investment mechanism. Can this be written? Yes, I'm prepared to write it. We are now talking, of course, with an extremely important party in the European Union. I am prepared, I'm offering myself to work for Italy, for the Italian delegation. In the Glasgow Convention of the Parties, number 26, in the drafting of these two agreements that are needed. One, transform the carbon market into a carbon removal market. And two, transform the clean development mechanism into the clean investment mechanism, transforming negative into positive. Can this be done? Yes. Will it be done? I don't know. Time is very short.
E a proposito di questo, abbiamo un paio di domande.
We have a couple of questions which can be combined. You talked about investments in clean energy as a strategy. One of the questions is this. Do you think that the new strategies by the European Commission, guided by Ursula von der Leyen, communicated months ago concerning the green economy, i.e. investments which are made with respect to the environment, is that the right direction, or is it simply wishful thinking, which has to be confirmed and strengthened by the choices of individual countries? Then, a second question. You know that there are many expectations in the world on the outcome of the US elections. I'm sure that there will be an impact depending on the winner in terms of the adoption of strategies to counter the global warming. What's your opinion on these two things?
First of all, on the European Union Commission, its president, Ursula, I'm just going to call her Ursula for short, is absolutely right, but it's not sufficient. She doesn't seem to know that we have to develop a whole new industry of carbon removal. She's, like you, talking more about clean technologies, but there are clean technologies and clean technologies. I want to be totally clear. We need to transform the power industry to use photovoltaic, solar energy, and clean energy like wind. We do. But it is not enough. It's no longer enough. We need to do more. We need to remove the CO2 that is already there. That's called carbon removal. As far as I know, Ursula doesn't contemplate in her Green New Deal the strategies involving carbon removal. And that's what needs to be done. Because carbon removal is positively producing investment opportunities and funding and jobs, etc., which simply clean energy will not do. So that's my response about the European Commission strategy. And while I'm at it, I'm going to applaud the European Commission. Because if the whole world was doing what the European Union is doing now, we wouldn't have climate change. This is a fact. So we had to applaud, first of all. And after we applaud, we had to say the effort is not enough. We now had to go for carbon removal, not just clean technology. In other words, solar photovoltaic is extremely important, is not enough. There is no time to let that work because it's a $60 trillion a year power plant industry that has to be transformed. It's going to take decades. So the way to do it is use finance, use liquidity, create new financial instruments, as I just mentioned. Can this be done? Yes. And what about the elections in the United States? Well, along with everybody else, I find the problem of the elections in the United States something to be worried about because of the way people are behaving. And it is unfortunate for the United States to be in such a situation in the global economy. However, I have to say the 45Q legislation that we passed was bipartisan and is now law. And it rewards carbon removal from the atmosphere. It's the most advanced in the world. It is possible, I don't know how likely, that either of the two parties that are the main contenders will support the liquidity increase as well as the infrastructure investment which is approximately $1.3 trillion needed in order to put this plan into action. But you don't need to spend the $1 trillion. You need investment, which means that investment is going to produce revenues, it's going to produce profits, it's going to produce jobs. And that is what Ursula and the European Commission should be doing too. In some sense, everybody should do that. Now, can this be done? I am an economist, among other things, and I feel that yes. And I'm working with Barclays Bank in the creation of financial instruments that can bring this to reality. Because as I said, the liquidity needed now by everybody acknowledges we need a lot of liquidity, and you know it's happening. I'm not saying it, it's just happening. All governments are contributing to the liquidity needed. And that's true in Europe, but it's also true in the United States. So if we can recast the carbon market to produce the incentives for carbon removal investment and carbon removal market and carbon removal liquidity and carbon removal economic growth, as I said before, the solution is in our hands. Not only is in our hands, but it will create an enormous panorama of economic growth, of economic success, and it will favor low-income people. Because the CO2 that we're removing from the atmosphere is distributed uniformly on the planet, which is not true for petroleum. And therefore, everybody will have access to that CO2 as a source of jobs, as a source of goods, as a source of services, as a source of food, beverages, clean fuels, etc. All of that, which I already explained several times, and I'm not going to repeat here, is available to everybody because the air is available to everybody. And the concentration of CO2 in the air, very unusual, is uniformly distributed over the entire planet. And that favors the lower income groups. So we are perhaps at the beginning of a transformation which can lead to finally overcome some of the worst characteristics of human beings, which is the destructive, unequal form in which our economies have grown. And the problem of satisfaction of basic needs that I referred to before. I hope this provides the answer you wanted me to say.
Molte grazie per queste risposte.
Thank you very much. Our time is nearly over, but even though we have many questions, there is one which I think is very important to conclude our conversation. That concerns culture. Do you think that in this moment in history, people are aware, the public opinion, is it aware of the risks that we have? Sometimes we note, or we have the impression, that a part of the public opinion is not really concerned or aware of a global warming. Many think that this is something that will be solved by future generations. How can we, what can we say? It's a cultural problem rather than an economic or social one, the attitude of people.
Not just a cultural problem, but there's also a social problem, both. And I became an economist. My first studies were in pure mathematics. I became an economist because humans are very advanced in physics, very advanced in mathematics, and very behind in cultural and social issues, very much behind. We solve our cultural and social problems by killing each other, which is unbelievable at this stage of civilization. Can this be done? Again, if you try to solve the problem by itself and change the culture, no. Culture has its own, culture is extremely important. It is the air that we breathe. It is the water in which we swim. It is who we are. And culture is not something that you're going to go and change, like an engineer may think. Absolutely not. But culture is us. And the world is changing. And it is possible that the culture can follow because, for example, unfortunately, climate change is already producing catastrophes now. And if you are in the United States and you see week after week what's happening in California, which is similar to what happened in Australia, and it's going to happen all over the world, you have a combination of these wildfires, which are totally unprecedented, and also floods, and etc. Then you realize that people are starting to understand this is happening. But there is a cultural issue here, which is the following. It is natural for humans not to want to think about the problem if they think it has no solution. Why would you think about it? So it is critical to have solutions and to focus on solutions, not to focus just on the problem. Because humans are structured so they can deal with solutions and then are attracted by solutions. And this is what the evolution of our species is all about. So if we just talk about climate change and how everything is being destroyed and catastrophically advancing, then you're not going to get a lot of cultural support. But if you find moves that we discussed that incorporate everybody, at this point, the rich and the poor, unfortunately, everybody has to be included. And we find a solution that is positive for the economy and that is real. And it can be done with the companies that we all know, that we love, or we may not love, but we know and we feel that we understand. It is for us to make that feasible, to make that accessible, and to let people think. So the culture, which are the feelings, our social feelings, can follow. We need more information in that direction. For this reason, this festival creates a very important tool, which is it helps create the culture where the solution can emerge. You are creating the culture. You are the main element of the solution. And I wanted to say thank you very much for allowing me to be here with you. And thank you very much because you are going to create a solution.
Grazie, veramente grazie.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We fully agree on the fact that we are here to lay the cultural conditions so that people become more and more aware on these issues. Thank you for the questions. That shows that you followed us and they have understood your message. Thank you very much again from us all, from the Festival of the Economics. My personal thanks. I hope I could meet you personally. Who knows? At the end of the pandemic, we'll manage.
Bye bye.
Bye bye. Thank you.